May the words of my mouth and the meditation of my heart be acceptable in your sight, O Lord, my strength and my Redeemer. Amen. Please be seated. As I mentioned a few moments ago, today we often celebrate the feast of St. Francis. But I decided to stick with the lectionary readings for this Sunday in the regular lectionary cycle. And now, even right now, I'm beating myself up about that for not taking the easier path. It's nice to talk about animals and gospels and things, but it's hard to talk about this parable in this gospel before us because it's hardly on anyone's top 10 list of beloved stories. It's filled with corruption and violence and murder. And if that weren't enough, for over 2,000 years, it's been interpreted by far too many in the church to justify the exclusion and even the attempted extinction of the Jews. Because looking at this parable, some have claimed that they forfeited their position as God's chosen people when the Jews denied Jesus' authority. Some have even gone so far as to claim that the Jews killed Jesus. Now that is anti-Semitism and hate, my friends. Jesus, after all, was a Jew for his entire earthly ministry. No, it's important to circle back and to remember that when Jesus tells a parable, it's important to read it as though it applies to us, because that's exactly how Jesus used his parables. Now, of course, the last thing we want to do with this one is exactly that, because those main characters are awful. But in order to faithfully engage this parable, we have to do one of the hardest things to do for us in 21st century America, to lean into our discomfort rather than push it away from us or deny it, to accept that this story has something to say about us, to acknowledge that we are not mere bystanders, but participants in the injustices and the violence that surrounds us. It's way too easy to use these parables to point fingers at others, even those who've already been marginalized historically, like the Jews. But let's take a breath and ask ourselves to consider how we ourselves are the evil tenants in Jesus' parable. Now, the Jesus of Jesus' parables is that they can be applied to many different situations. Those who heard Jesus' parables at the time understood the vineyard to be a symbol for Israel. And since they were Israelites, that means they understood that he was saying that they should correct their own behavior. Thus, if we enter into these parables correctly, we cannot use them to judge others. Instead, we must see them as a mirror in which our own lives are reflected. Now, one of the theological claims attributed to St. Francis was a sense of unity and harmony in all creation. The idea that the love of God is revealed in the natural world, as St. Francis extolled in his Canticle of Brother Sun and Sister Moon, which I urge you to look up and read sometime. And on this feast day of St. Francis, we can take the parable of the vineyard as a commentary on how we treat creation, on how we treat the earth and all her creatures. And that would align nicely with the concern St. Francis himself spoke of. You know, what would it be like to see all of creation and to know all of creation as beloved, precious family, rather than tools or objects of exploitation? Too often we use poor interpretations of texts in Genesis to claim that God gave us human beings dominion over all of the earth. For some, that leads to ideas that we can use up this beautiful earth and its resources as we see fit. What if, instead, we saw ourselves as tenants, placed by God within the vineyard of the earth to tend it and care for it? In our parable before us today, the tenants try to steal the earth, try to steal the vineyard, which is not theirs. And they're willing to kill and destroy in order to accomplish that theft. Yet, as we're reminded in Psalm 24, the one that comes right after the beloved Psalm 23, we're reminded this: the earth is the Lord's and everything in it, the world and its inhabitants too. Because God is the one who established it on the seas, God set it firmly on the waters. Who can ascend the Lord's mountain? Who can stand in his holy sanctuary? Only the one with clean hands and a pure heart, the one who hasn't made false promises, the one who hasn't sworn dishonestly. That kind of person receives blessings from the Lord and righteousness from the God who saves. And that's how things are with the generation that seeks him, that seeks the face of Jacob's God. Now we, like those murderous tenants, reject the sovereignty of God when we look at rising seas and melting glaciers, at devastating wildfires and catastrophic floods, things that have gone from being once-in-a-lifetime events to yearly events. When we look at those things and say that we can do nothing, or deny that we have anything to do with such devastation, it's dishonest, and in this case foolhardy, to claim powerlessness right in the midst of our simultaneous proclamation that we can do anything we want without consequences. Now we could also see the vineyard as being the ground of our hearts. Do we acknowledge God's ownership of that territory? Or do we reject Jesus and throw him out whenever he asks of us what we do not wish to give? Our time, our talent, our treasure, and especially our obedience. Do we reject Jesus and throw him from the vineyard of our hearts when, in response to the new life that he offers us as a gift, we instead see a threat to our insistence on our utter and complete independence? We throw Jesus from the vineyard by our resistance to empathy and love of each other, so that we can instead be selfish and cruel and raise them up as virtues. No, the way of God cannot be aligned with contempt for God's creation or anybody or anything in it, or with a delight in cruelty or mockery. We always have to remember that a vineyard is judged by the fruit it produces. And hateful, careless behavior from people who claim to be faithful children of God is a large part of why so many people are turning their backs on faith today. As Christian convert G.K. Chesterton cynically noted, the Christian ideal has not been tried and found wanting. It has been found difficult and left untried. I like to think he was speaking out of his own despair and frustration. The vineyard is the Christian ideal of abundance, compassion, justice and compassion and abundance that leads to true peace. Which brings us back to St. Francis. Now, even though most scholars realize that it's highly unlikely that St. Francis actually wrote the famous peace prayer that bears his name, the one we'll say in a few minutes, nonetheless, the sentiments in that prayer beautifully express the components of a society grounded in love, justice, and peace. One in which injustice, cruelty, and contempt for each other and this world become unimaginable. That same sentiment is also found in this beautiful poem by farmer and agrarian and poet Wendell Berry, entitled "The Peace of Wild Things." He writes, "When despair for the world grows in me, and I wake in the night at the least sound, in fear of what my life and my children's lives may be, I go and lie down where the wood drake rests in his beauty on the water, and the great heron feeds. I come into the peace of wild things, who do not tax their lives with forethought of grief. I come into the presence of still water, and I feel above me the day-blind stars waiting with their light. For a time, I rest in the grace of the world and am free." I rest in the grace of the world and I am free. Amen to that. What if each of us resisted the despair of the world and what's going on in it right now and what we do to each other? if we resisted it by dedicating ourselves to changing it, no matter what it costs temporarily? What if we resisted the despair of the world by remembering our oneness with this beautiful planet and with every single person and thing in it and on it? What if we welcomed the owner of all and his beloved Son into the vineyard of our hearts, instead of the wilderness of our fear being all-consuming over us? Vineyards are like gardens, and in the words of Joni Mitchell, we've got to get ourselves back to the garden. In the end, even this parable of the murderous tenants contains good news, however, because it's about justice and reconciliation, about reclamation, about turning aside from paths that lead us into sin, about embracing the generous love of God and being remade by it. Jesus' parables call on us to reimagine the world and to reimagine our lives, if only we allowed ourselves to be fertile ground and faithful tenants within the abundant vineyard of God. Amen.